Alright guys, so earlier on today I uploaded a quite a long video, 30-minute game, unrated game against somebody played rated kind of mid 800s, something like that. And it was a really good game. I didn't play my best, and there were lots and lots of blunders and lots of missed wins, but it's just really interesting, isn't it, how like the way I describe it is every dog has its day. You know, you can do very well against people who are higher rated, and quite honestly, you will play better chess when you play people who are rated higher than you than when you play people rated below you. So here's a couple of examples. I've just played. I picked up a couple of unrated challenges. So this one came from open challenges, and then the next one just came through from a chess.com friend. So in this one, my opponent's rated 1865. Now, I don't know how many wins I've ever had against anyone of that level. So I've got the black pieces, and we have the French defense. My opponent now plays his knight out to c3, I play d5, and we have the exchange variation with the knight out here. Other knight comes out, queen comes out with check. Okay, so I simply block with my dark squared bishop. That means the bishop is not actually defending this knight because it is pinned against my king. And now we have queen to b5 with another check, and this again can simply be parried with pawn to c6. So now the queen has to move. So that is not a move that you'd expect to see from an 1800 player, but it is the kind of move that you could expect to see from an 1800 player who is playing too casually and thinks he's going to walk a game. Okay, so the queen comes all the way back to e2. So white's just burned two moves and done nothing to help his own development, although he has given my queen a new diagonal. Thank you very much. So I now castle. Knight comes in. So again, he's breaking opening principles. He's moving a piece that he's already developed a second time. I put my rook across to e8 now because I notice the king and queen are in line with each other. Right? You have to be very conscious of these things. So now we have d4, and I bring out my bishop now to g4, hitting the queen. Now I expected white to push f3 here, which I knew would just weaken his structure, and he does push f3, and I just drop my bishop back here to f5. All right. Now the queen dodges to one side, so clearly there are dangers of, should this bishop ever move, the queen and the king would be in line. However, white does have the ability to block with a variety of material. So the queen dodges out the way, and now I play h6, hitting the knight. The knight only actually has one square where it can go to. Because of this f3 push, it's going to have to go back to h3, so it does. And now there's thoughts of maybe capturing the knight, forcing the pawns to double and isolate. However, that would also open up the g-file for white's rook, facing off to my king. And I just don't want to do that. So I come up with a plan. Right? So the queen has moved off of the e-file. However, the king is still on the e-file. Okay? So I still have possibilities for a discovered check, if not a pin on the queen, right? But so I'm thinking what I would love to do is play bishop to g5 with an attack on the queen and a discovered check on the king. Now there would be no way to get out of those. The only way, say if the bishop was here, right? The queen could block there or block there to block the check, but still then rook takes queen, okay? So I now play my knight to h7. And the idea is that now I can put my bishop on g5 with the hit on the queen, okay? And white, for some reason, okay, he's rated high 1800s, misses the threat, and just pushes g4. So I just play bishop to g5. So white is now in check, and the queen is under attack. There's nothing that can be done. King moves, I grab the queen, now I grab a pawn, and my opponent resigns. So this is absolutely fascinating. You know, I get so many of my games, I'll say, oh, this is a game against an 1100 player who plays really, really badly. And people say in the comments, oh, my opponents never play that badly. But people do. People do play badly at every level. We have good days, we have bad days, right? And my opponent, my 800 rated opponent from this morning, played really well against me. And it went all the way down to the wire. Eventually he lost on time in a 30-minute game. But it was a good game. And I played worse in that game for some reason. So here you go. It's a very quick win over somebody rated 300 points higher than 400 points higher than me. Okay, so here's the next one. So this is from Shadow Mikey, chess.com buddy. Sent a challenge through, 10-minute, unrated, and again I've got the black pieces, and again we play the French. So d4, obvious, d5, always played, and now knight to c3. Now there's a couple of moves here. I mean, c5 is very common. I kind of played that almost instinctively. But bringing your bishop out to b4, pinning the knight, is also pretty sharp as well. But I played the more kind of traditional c5 Marshall variation. And now the knight comes out. But what we have here is now that this pawn can capture. So a wing pawn can capture a center pawn. Fine, okay. This game actually goes all the way. And now I bring my bishop out, now that my c-pawn has moved. So I do have this kind of pawn majority in the centre. My opponent here, by the way, is rated 1725, so 250 points higher than me. We have pawn takes, and now instead of capturing back straight away, I decide to take the knight as an in-between move, which is going to force white's pawns to double and isolate. So these are all now isolated pawns. Well, kind of. Depends what happens to this guy. So queen captures d5. And so we're equal in material. I've actually given up a bishop. And now Mikey plays queen f3, proposing a trade of queens. Now I don't want to do this straight away, so I just develop my knight. He now brings out his bishop to a3. And this is a pest because it's covering the f8 square, so now I can't castle, which is what I want to do. So develop my final knight, pins the knight, breaks the pin, rook to d1. And now I go in, basically forcing, trying to force an exchange of queens really, but on my own terms with queen to e3. Now he, instead of swapping off queens, because clearly if he captures here, I capture there, and I'm looking at this pawn, potentially with a fork on rook and bishop, and he didn't fancy initiating that exchange. So he drops his bishop out to e2. Now I grab the knight, and we trade queens. And now I drop my knight into c3, where I'm forking the rook, the bishop, and the a2 pawn. So he moves his rook. I grab the bishop, so now he no longer has the bishop pair, and also his king has been forced to move. However, like we say, the queens are off the board, and so we're now in the end game phase of the chess game. However, do you notice the tactic that is shouting out? Okay, from this exchange, okay, I grab the bishop, and the rook can't capture. Really, I think the rook, maybe if it had come to d2, it would have been a bit better. But he came here onto a light square, right? I take, king takes, bishop to b5. Right, the rook is now pinned, the rook cannot move, and there's no option to block with a pawn, because I'll simply take the pawn and the pin is still on. So rook attacks bishop, bishop takes rook, king takes. Now I decide to castle long. This bishop is still preventing me from castling short, but I figure, see with this, after the king recaptures, the rook is looking at b7. So I mean, what I want to do is I want to get my rooks onto these semi-open files, really. So the quickest way to defend the pawn, I don't want to put my rook here and tie it down to babysitting a pawn. Also, I mean, b6 is an option. That takes away a couple of squares from the dark squared bishop. So that could have been played as well. But I decided, let's do two things at once, right? Castle gets my rook immediately in line with my opponent's king. And there's the idea of this push here to attack the pinned piece because the pawn is pinned. Okay, so we have bishop to there. Now I simply push b6, kick the bishop. Bishop now attacks the rook. No worries. Rook d7 attacks the bishop right back. Bishop moves. Pawn kick. Bishop moves up again. And now e5. Okay, but this pawn is defended twice. So we have pawn comes down, takes, king to b7. So I just want to get my king out of line of any checking ideas. And we have a4 and a5 just to stop this pawn in its tracks. I don't want any funny business. Okay, now obvious tactic here. This pawn is pinned. It's in an absolute pin. It cannot legally move. So this pawn is not defending this pawn. So this is called attacking the pinned piece. Okay, or attacking a piece whose defender is pinned. Right. So the bishop could actually grab this pawn, and I can't recapture. Okay, so king a6, keeping it on a light square because he's only got a dark square bishop. And now if bishop takes, king takes, or pawn takes is perfectly playable. So bishop comes back. Now I double up my rooks, and king moves out of line. Rook e8, again preferring to keep my my rooks on light squares. Also notice here that with the rook to here, we have the same exact tactic, right? Rook could capture d4. It's defended only by that bishop, but the bishop is in an absolute pin, okay? So he has to do something. King moves again. Now h6, rook comes down, rook to d6, just shoring up my defenses here. And maybe thinking about doubling up as well there, but don't know. Pawn d5. So now, oh yeah, so I'm defending this pawn actually a second time. That's the point of that move, because he's got rook and bishop now looking at this pawn. So now it's defended by rook and then finally the king. So pawn pushes down, rook to e5. So now I've got two attackers on this pawn. And I fall here for the trap. The exact same thing. Can you see how the same tactics come up over and over and over again, right? I put both of my rooks on dark squares after being, congratulating myself of how well I was doing putting them all on light squares, and fall for a pin. Okay, so now rook to f5 attempts to get out of the losing material by pinning the bishop. So now the bishop cannot capture the rook. However, as soon as the king moves, now this rook is under attack by the king, this rook is under attack by the bishop. So, desperado time, I have to capture the bishop, giving back the exchange, and now we are materially equal. So now g6, right? Key structure to remember in endgames: when you've got a king coming towards you, line up your pawns in a defensive wall, and the king cannot get into this space at all. Okay, and now we have a lot of pushing and shoving, right? So here, this is an interesting one with these two pawns here, because I had to think about, I want to stop the king in particular from coming to this square, right? King can't come here because of my pawn, and currently it can't come here because of this pawn. But so if, for example, white plays f5, I just push g5 and the pawns are locked in there and the king cannot get through, right? So if my pawn was on here, this square is unavailable for the king, and also still this square, so the king cannot actually get round this island of pawns in any way. However, I also need to be aware of g5, and then if I lock off, I'm undefending this square and the king can come in. Notice at this time that with a 10-minute game, my opponent's under 2 minutes now. I'm on 3 minutes 10. Okay, and we do have g5, the correct move. And here I decide, instead of pushing f5 and abandoning the defense of e5, I figure, look, if he wants to capture, I can recapture with my rook, and that's okay. So that's actually what happens, and the king does indeed come to e5. But now I can push forward. Rook f5. White's in check. Can't capture the rook. The rook is defended permanently by this pawn, right? And the king really does need to maintain the defense of f4. So the king moves back to e4. I move my rook back. I move my rook up again. I'm really kind of in almost a zugzwang situation. I don't really want to change anything. But it's pretty sharp, but he's down to nearly a minute. So now I move my king back, and now he pushes d6. I capture d6. Okay, and now white's got a choice. I mean, white could capture this pawn. Then my king would have to move somewhere. Then he's got the option of capturing that pawn and undefending that rook. But he decides to trade rooks at this point. So now, very critical end game. And this is interesting. So I do have a one pawn advantage. So my advantage is here, right? So I do have b5. If he takes, my a pawn is free, right? b5, if he doesn't take, my b pawn is free. Okay, so now, king takes pawn. But this is key. The king has just moved in front of the pawn, so it's going to take another move for this king to vacate the f-file. So we've got the king's got to move, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 5 moves, okay, for white to be able to promote. And it's my turn, okay. So I push b5, and he moves the king. And now it's just a race to the line. But notice where he's put his king. And this is critical. And this, I think, is an error, probably caused by being low on time. He's put his king on this diagonal here, right? And what's important about that is that my promotion square is b1, right? So, but here's the problem, you know, he still wants to defend this pawn possibly against my king. That's the issue. So g6 in many ways is the right square because it covers the pawn all the way for 3 jumps. f6 is just too slow. It doesn't get the king off the f-file. And he can't come here or here. So his only real options are those two. So he goes there, and now I promote, but it comes with check. And this is key, you know. If the king had been on there, I'd have promoted, he'd have promoted with check. And suddenly he is odds on to win the game. But as it is, I promote and it comes with check, so he doesn't have time to promote his pawn. Check, 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 check. Lots of checks. Okay. And now I need to avoid draw by repetition. So here I actually give him the opportunity to promote and trade queens, and that is exactly what happens because I know that my king has the inside line up here. So lots of moves. Now again, king to b3, and now there's no way that this king can get to stop this pawn, right? Because my king has this force field all the way around him. So the king's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps to go, and it's not going to work. Okay. Up to there, king, queen there, and it's now a straightforward. So I bring my king all the way around. Probably not the quickest checkmate in the world. Here we have to be very, very careful. Okay, so right now, white has no squares after the king goes into the corner. So this is a stalemate situation. So I have to move my queen well out of the way. King comes there. Queen now to the g-file. Notice that the kings are in opposition, right? So this king, now being in check by the queen, has to retreat onto the side of the board. And now king moves again into opposition, and checkmate. There you go. With only less than 3 seconds left on the clock, but really interesting couple of games, you know, just to have a game against somebody rated many, many hundred points lower than me, and it goes down to the wire. And then to have games against an 1800 and a 1700 and manage to win both, it really does make you think that giant hunting is the way to go. But yeah, so I thought you'd enjoy those couple of games, and again, I would just really encourage everybody to go out and play people who are stronger than you, who are higher rated than you. You will get better games. You will have to dig deeper. You'll have to play your best chess that you're capable of playing. Plus, if you lose, you don't lose as many points, and if you win, of course, these two games are both unrated, but if you win, you can win more points as well. So, bottom line, if you want to get better, play stronger players, okay? And remember, every dog has its day. Okay, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you later.